program about Brattleboro Area Hospice that brings you news and information about the activities and services that are available from Brattleboro Area Hospice. My name is Richard Ewald, and I'm a hospice volunteer for the Brattleboro Area Hospice. Joining me today is Bettina Berg, who is volunteer and education coordinator for Brattleboro Area Hospice. Welcome, Bettina.
Thank you.
Although it always feels odd to say welcome because you work here and I'm a visitor.
It's always nice to have you back here.
Thank you. I know Bettina from taking the hospice care training myself. That's one thing that she does a great deal here, training people to be volunteers who go out to spend time with folks who are dying and their families, and also folks who do bereavement care, spending time with folks who have experienced a death in their family. Can you tell us a little bit about the hospice care volunteer training?
Sure.
Once a year?
It typically runs twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
We run it in the fall as an evening training and in the spring as a morning training to try to catch people whose work schedules or life schedules need one or the other. Last year, because we found ourselves in more need of bereavement volunteers than hospice care volunteers, we only ran it once last year, but typically it's twice a year. It's an 11-week, 33-hour training. So we meet once a week for 11 consecutive weeks, 1 day a week, and it's a 33-hour commitment that we ask people to sign up for. What else would be helpful to hear?
Well, I think it's worth reminding folks that Brattleboro Area Hospice delivers most of its services. It helps the community largely through its volunteers. And as a volunteer myself, I certainly came to it from my own life experience and with some goals in mind. And it only slowly dawned on me after that time that I was really becoming, at that point, a representative for Brattleboro Area Hospice. And it is sort of a serious responsibility to sort of do the right thing for folks who are needing us to spend time with them. I could narrate my own experience, but from your perspective, how do you start with someone who calls you on the phone and says, I'm thinking about volunteering?
I often start by just asking people what's prompted them to call, because periodically someone will call who has experienced a death recently, maybe with hospice care, and there's that sense of wanting to give back and in those cases, sometimes people, what they really are looking for is a support group more than they are a volunteer training. So I always just start there to clarify what's drawing somebody to the training.
Because it's not a support group.
It is not. We really even ask people if they've experienced a death loss within a year that they not do the training. We really recognize through experience that people need time to take care of themselves in the year following a significant death. And that we have other services people can do. But many people who do choose to volunteer are drawn because they've seen hospice at work and they have a family member who's had services, and it is that wanting to give back. From there, if after a conversation, the trainings work through an application and interview process. So I ask people to sit and write down some experiences, how they sort of envision volunteering, and then I meet with them, and if we all seem to line up and put together usually a pretty amazing group of 10 to 12 people who meet for that period of time. We're non-medical, so what we really are looking for from volunteers is a capacity to be present, to be caring, and basically just to show up. There's not, in some ways, a whole lot more to it than that. I think one of the most important things is and this is what we try to accomplish through the training, is having people muck around with their own experiences around death and dying, and what comes up and what might I need to take care of in myself before I head out and try to be supportive to somebody else.
Having been through that experience, I think mucking is a very good word to use, from the standpoint of warning away some folks who have recently experienced a death as being something that's a little maybe too tender for them to approach. I'll have to say that going through the training requires all of us to really confront our own previous experiences of death, our own feelings about death, our own anticipation of death, and that's not an easy thing. This is not like training someone to fix a spare tire on a bicycle. So how can I know if I'm putting myself out there, okay, I think I might like to volunteer, but this sounds a little challenging. What do you provide as part of that challenge that helps us feel safe?
I think one of the most important things is, and I think we have volunteers who've been with this organization for 20 years who would say, you're always in process yourself, and that's what is most helpful. Is we can't script people, we can't really provide people with answers. What we can do, or what we try to do through the training, is put our volunteers in an awareness of what they maybe are triggered by, is a word we use sometimes, and support them around when those things come up, so that they can both, it's kind of a dual process of noticing what's coming up in me and how do I take care of that, what's coming up for the family that I'm working with and how do I support that. And that's kind of the beauty of the training. It's those hours where you get to just explore it, and everything is just an exercise and everything is information. And I think people go away learning a lot about how to be a support. They learn a lot about maybe specific diseases that we tend to see in our clientele, but most importantly, how I will be in those situations, or how I hope to be when I'm faced with those situations.
Sort of rehearse those emotions.
Yeah.
Well, now that I think of it, unless we go through our entire lives with blinders on, we will have to face this sooner or later, and to face it in this way, in a group that that's held in a safe place, and be able to process this with other folks who are going through it. It seems like, why would we not all do it? So I'm surprised in a way that the community isn't knocking your doors down. Do you have to turn people away from the training?
I do periodically. I've gotten to the point where I advertise sometimes very little, because I do have a lot of people who are interested. But I would always encourage people to get in touch with me if they think it's something they're interested in, because people's lives change, and the timing of the trainings sometimes works for people and other times don't. So I keep a file of people to contact, and certainly if somebody's listening to this and thinking, well, it doesn't sound like they need more volunteers, we are always looking to increase our pool. That's actually the main goal of the training. We want people to partake of what we have here. But if people come to the training, we really are looking for them to step up and volunteer. And out of that came the death and dying class that I had mentioned to you, called Death and Dying for Beginners, which is a condensed version, 4 weeks of readings, discussions, exercises, that allow people to have a similar experience to the training, but really without the goal of going
becoming
out
a
and
volunteer.
doing that piece.
You mentioned that Brattleboro Area Hospice is always looking for more volunteers. How many active volunteers do you have?
It's hard to say. We have a lot of names on our list that we can call, probably 50 to 75 people. But trying to match someone who needs care on a Wednesday afternoon, who has cats, who also smokes, you can sort of see the challenge. You
If
need
I'm
a
allergic to smoke
volunteer
or
who,
okay.
if you're not a cat person, if you can't be around smoking, it limits that pool.
Well, raises a good point then. If what would a volunteer's expectation be about time commitment? Could I go to someone's place 1 hour a week, or 2 hours a week, or 1 day a week, or how does it work?
We ask people to hold as a ballpark figure 3 hours a week, once a week. So that's the commitment. So not all of our volunteers are falling into that at any given time. But that can be typical for a number of our volunteers. Sometimes in facilities, if we're going in where there's nursing care provided, and it might be a shorter visit, might be an hour or two, or split those 3 hours up over the course of the week.
Because a volunteer may be going into a home, or maybe going into a nursing home or a hospital.
Right.
I see.
Right. We kind of go wherever we're needed is really how we try to do that. So.
And generally the Windham County area.
That's right. Yeah.
So how does the hospice care volunteer training differ from the bereavement care volunteer training? A whole separate class?
It's a whole separate class. The bereavement care training is 7 weeks. Again, that 3 hour at a time seems to be a good amount of time. It seems like a lot when you sit here and say it's 3 hours. It goes really quickly, as you know. You sit down at 9 and you can't believe it's noon. And so that one is 7 weeks. And how it differs, I would say, is that we're really flipping the lens to looking at how we support people when the loss has occurred. And that's not to say that people experiencing someone's death and approaching death aren't grieving. It just means that after the death has occurred, things change and people need support in different ways. And what we can offer is help with, Elizabeth probably spoke to this, with day-to-day tasks for people, or just, again, companionship. And that's where the trainings, I think, are similar, that if there's an overarching goal, it's listening. It's sitting down, meeting somebody where they are, and they determine what that is. Both of the trainings bring in a lot of speakers from our community, people who are experts in their field who can really lead the class through things that are important to know. In the bereavement training, particularly children and teens, and how children experience grief. And again, asking volunteers to think about when they were children or young adults, losses that they've had and how that may have impacted them.
Are there certain personal traits or characteristics or personalities where some volunteers are more suited to the hospice care or more suited to bereavement care?
It's interesting to me.
I mean, on the face of it, one difference is that if you're doing hospice care, you are looking at the situation of a dying person. And with the bereavement, you're not.
That's right. And I think another thing I sometimes think of with hospice is it's almost like, sometimes when you go on a first visit, it's kind of like a blind date. You're meeting somebody, you're going to see how it goes, and yet you know where that relationship is headed in a sense. And with the bereavement, and I think what draws people some to bereavement is the growth that comes and the healing that does come. It may take a long time, but that there's such hopefulness, I think, that comes from doing that kind of work, which also makes me want to say that our volunteers doing hospice work, and even in the training, do not experience it as a depressing type of volunteering. There may be sadness, there may be mystery, there may be other things that come up, but in none of the trainings or in the death and dying class do people really find it depressing. And that may just be why people are drawn to it. Maybe folks that, I mean, you probably hear when you say you're a hospice volunteer, people say, yikes, I could never do that. And there are people for whom it is not a fit.
Well, I would have to say, as a volunteer who's been through the training, that the training involves sort of a calming down of our own minds about it, and a sort of a reframing about the experience, to the point where maybe we don't bring all of that, the weight of fears and whatever else is all wrapped up in it, so that we can sort of quiet ourselves and be there for the client, which is certainly a different way and raises different expectations that we might have. The time periods would seem to be different too. With the hospice care, it's likely to be a shorter period. Bereavement is likely to be a little longer.
Possibly, depending on, it's so individual. It just depends on the need. But but I think that's a fair.
With the hospice care, there's a last chapter.
Yes.
The bereavement care is more open-ended.
It
So
is.
are there issues around when is it time for it to stop?
Yeah. I've heard stories of volunteers who have really become friends with clients that they've seen, and they dissolve the volunteer relationship.
It just changes.
It takes oversight from the people here to help navigate that.
That's interesting. Could you talk about that a bit? Because I think all of us would have some hurdles in either situation. I'm in a house where someone is dying, and I'm really spending some time with the family, and we're all in this very fragile, emotionally charged situation. It's an intimate relationship that gets established with certain boundaries. With the bereavement, it's also a similar emotionally charged situation, and certainly there is going to be an exchange of feelings, expression of feelings. Could you talk a bit about how we stop that from becoming too personal or too much, or how is that boundary negotiated?
Certainly there's good supervision here for helping volunteers with that, and it is part of the training of, and I want to back up and say, I think for many people who seek out bereavement services, it's exactly the boundary, the sort of invisible boundary that makes it work. They're talking to someone who is not a family member, who is not invested. And I think that sets up a certain amount of freedom for people to feel comfortable. Over time, perhaps that changes, perhaps it doesn't, and it's really on an individual basis that it happens. But the whole notion of boundaries and confidentiality, those things are really important for our volunteers to keep in mind, so that whether they're bereavement clients, hospice clients, can really feel safe and in what they're entering into.
So it's actually part of the service to the client for the volunteer to maintain the boundary.
Absolutely. And
we can err by erasing the boundary and trying to be too much of a friend.
I think that is true. And like so often, sometimes we don't know it's happened until it's
too
already
late.
happened.
Right.
And it, things work
Then
out.
you just deal
Yeah,
with it,
yeah.
Well, if you are interested in becoming a Brattleboro area hospice volunteer for either the hospice care or for the bereavement, 257-0775, and just talk to anyone who answers the phone and tell them what you're interested in. One of the things I'd like to talk more about is the class that you described called Death and Dying for Beginners. An intriguing name.
I couldn't think of anything else.
Well, it certainly catches the attention because it raises the question, are there also classes for intermediates or advanced?
I've had people suggest maybe there should be.
So this isn't training, it's more of an informational...
It is.
It's not a support group either.
It's not. What it came from the hospice training of having people who wanted to come to the training but really knew they weren't going to volunteer. And just something that we felt was important to offer free of charge to the community. Anybody who wants to just have that discussion or is interested in talking about issues related to death and dying, because people show up and they say, well, I'm kind of interested in this, and I bring it up when I go out for dinner with people, and they think I'm
it's
weird.
It's a real conversation starter.
Exactly. So they come here. It's usually about a 2.5 hour class once a week for just 4 weeks, and readings.
So you establish a curriculum or some planned program, but it's possible for other stuff to just pop up.
Yeah, I have a little more freedom in the class to follow what's interesting to the people in the group. I kind of don't feel I have to cover certain things the way I do in the training.
So what do you head out to cover?
I think the things that seem to spark typically in this class, as I've been doing it since 2008, so it's taken a little time, but looking at early experiences with loss, I think people have stories. And
from when we're young.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when you ask people to think back on what was an early loss, what happened, what do you think you learned from that, and just pairing up and having somebody listen to your story.
That opens some doors.
We're off and running, oftentimes, from that point. I like to talk about certain aspects of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, the stages of, that we all tend to go through, any moments of crisis, but certainly is related to death and dying. We usually end up talking some about funerals, talking to letting people sort of explore what's available out there in terms of that. Spirituality often comes into it, what's important to people, what guides their life now as they're doing their day-to-day living. We do some exercises, and it's, again, people really seem to, we have a lot of laughs, surprisingly, although people do, again, it's not a support group, but I really work to make it a supportive group so that people feel they can talk about whatever they are interested in talking about. And again, that class I try to do twice a year. In the winter, I ran one in February in the evening, kind of late afternoon. So I'm hoping this summer to have a morning program. That's kind of maybe in July, four mornings a week.
Is that about a 10 or 12 person group as well?
Yeah, 10 to 12 seems to work best in terms of both the space that's available for us and just the dynamics of the group, because people like to talk, and if you have more than that, it really limits.
Could you give us a glimpse into some of the things that just sort of pop up? I know when we were talking before, you mentioned that people talked about near-death experiences.
I've had people, want to talk about near-death experience. Sometimes it's a place where talking about an anticipated death, how that feels versus a sudden death. And people in the group are often representative of both of those, where there have been losses from those. Sometimes people come because they are perhaps caring for an elderly parent, wondering what's that going to be like as I continue down that path. Some people come who have no experience at all with death and actually feel embarrassed that they're here because, well, I haven't had much loss. And
That's
so
okay.
yeah, exactly, you'll get your chance. But that's what brings them here, and they are interested in thinking about those things. It really, and sometimes I think for me a difference of not doing an application and interview process, which is I do for the training. With the class, I just ask people to call and register, have a short discussion about what brings them. But I often don't really know people's stories as they come through the door for the first class, and things get revealed over the course, and sometimes I'm amazed by people's stories myself of what what's bringing people and what they're thinking about, and it's been a really, I think, important service to offer the community. Again, it's free.
And there's one coming up this summer.
There will be one this summer, so
You can use the same number, 257-0775. Tell them you're interested in the program on
Death and
Dying for Beginners. We're all beginners, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You also, once a year, have the teleconference program, and that one is actually coming up too, isn't it?
It is.
And here we are talking late in April. So when I say it's coming up,
It's May 9th, Wednesday afternoon, May 9th. The topic this year is end-of-life ethics. And what happens is we meet at the Marlboro College Graduate Center down by the museum at 1:30 in the afternoon, and watch a pre-recorded session with a moderator interviewing various people, experts in the field, and having discussion. They're using a lot of case studies this year, looking back at things that have tweaked largely the medical community, but around ethics. And within that, we have 3 local panelists who will be on site to help us with discussion, questions about how this impacts us here, rather than just watching people out of Washington, D.C. So Ryan Murphy, who's here at Brattleboro Area Hospice and sits on the ethics committee at the hospital, Dr. Carolyn Taylor Olson will be a panelist, and Dr. Robert Tortolani. So 3 people with different experiences, able to hopefully make it kind of a lively and interesting discussion about ethics.
well, what are some of those ethical questions that come up?
Well, some of, I haven't actually watched the whole DVD yet, but I think where they are looking is that, and I'm not sure I can speak to specifics real well, but that things do come up for people. And in thinking about them, the little bit I've watched, it's murky stuff. I mean, as you can imagine, it just, so I'm not sure I can speak to that as well as I would like to. But I would encourage people to come. The little bit that I've seen, talking with the local people, I think it has the potential to be, may go away with more questions than answers, but that's part of the learning process, I guess. So.
And is there information about that on the hospice website?
You ask hard questions. I'm not sure. But there is information available here. If people are interested, they can call. We need people to pre-register. Again, it's a free event, but seating is limited. So we need people to pre-register, and I'd be happy to talk to people more one-on-one if they call about what.
And that is 257-0775, and I believe it's brattleborohospice.org.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. And last year was spirituality as related to end of life, and it was quite well done. So I'm looking forward to this one. I think it'll be. It sounds kind of dry ethics, but the little bit I've watched, it looks very rich, interesting.
Yeah, the word ethics is sort of dry, but really it's a whole field of making decisions that are all very wrenching, no matter how the decision is made, and who gets to make the decision, and when does that entity get to make the decision.
Yeah.
It's good as much as possible to have that sorted out ahead of time, if that can be done.
Yeah.
But often they're in the moment and seat of the pants, or
And I think the notion that how these decisions are made and what decisions are made really can impact the people who are left, the people who, after someone dies, what that experience is like carries over into how you grieve the loss. And so I think that is a piece that will definitely be considered.
And I would bet that the ethical issues that are discussed at this program are also covered in books or videos that are in the hospice library.
We do. This is the 19th year that they've had a teleconference. They used to be live, and I think they learned over time that having them pre-recorded helps on both the technical side of things and also helps us to prepare better. We can look at them ahead of time. But in our library, we have books from each of the years, and there are essays that go with them. And there have been teleconferences, like I said, on spirituality, one related specifically to cancer, one about Alzheimer's, one really looking at children and grief, how communities grieve. I think around 9/11 was kind of really looking at more global grief. And all of those books are available in the library, and most of the taped sessions are available as well.
I should mention too that the Brattleboro Area Hospice is located on Canal Street near the car wash, and on the first floor of this building, which is really an old residence, is a wonderful library with rugs on the floor, a nice rocking chair, a couple of comfortable chairs, and books, DVDs, cassettes on almost anything related to death and dying. Is it a lending library? Can you actually take a book out?
You can. It's a pretty simple system. You sign out a card, you stamp it, and you stamp your book, and you can walk away with it for a month. And there are people who really utilize that library more than any other service we can offer, is just being able to go there and take things out to read that they don't, at this point, need us for much else, but really use that as a resource. And there's a lot there.
We've been talking today with Bettina Berg at the Brattleboro Area Hospice about volunteer programs and about informational educational programs run by the Brattleboro Area Hospice. I would urge anyone who is considering this to call the hospice.
Absolutely.
You can talk to Bettina, or there are a number of people here you could talk to about what's involved in volunteering and the value of it to the community. Brattleboro Area Hospice provides its services primarily through neighbors, through the community itself, and it's a wonderful personal growing experience to do it, and it's a wonderful service to the community to get involved in this way. I want to thank you, Bettina. This has been very educational for me.
Good. Thank you.
And a great reminder of all the things that Brattleboro Area Hospice does for the folks of Windham County. Thanks very much, and hope to talk to you again.